Hi everyone, my name is Vincenzo Berghella. Pleasure to host again another AJOG MFM live event. This time's on randomized trials in obstetrics. There are so many issues to discuss today, and I have great experts to discuss those who have published in AJOG MFM their great studies. So I'll just go around the room as you see them on the screen and ask themselves to introduce themselves. Steve, do you want to start?
Thank you so much, Dr. Berghella. My name is Stephen Wagner. I'm a member of the faculty at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, affiliated with Harvard Medical School.
Megan?
Hi, thank you, Dr. Berghella, and this panel for organizing this live stream. I'm Megha Gupta. I'm a maternal fetal medicine specialist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, also affiliated with Harvard Medical School in Boston.
Thanks, Megan. And Aaron?
Hi, good evening. Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Aaron Dick. I'm a OBGYN resident at Hadassah Medical Center, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel.
Great. Akila?
Yeah, my name is Akila Subramaniam. I'm an associate professor of maternal fetal medicine as well as medical genetics at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and welcome the opportunity to present on behalf of one of our fellows who couldn't do that today.
Thanks, Akila. And Anna?
Hi, everyone. My name's Anna. I'm a third-year resident in the Department of OBGYN at Northwestern and a hopeful MFM. I'm really excited to be here on behalf of all of my co-authors.
Great. Let me share quickly the first slide. The issues are many for us to discuss. As usual, we'll do the presentation the first half hour, and then we'll have a discussion. Feel free from YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn to ask questions, etc. And thanks for many of you to watch us live. This is a study that was published just a few months ago at the end of last year from Dr. Jorgensen and colleagues who couldn't be here today. And they actually raised the issue that unfortunately, pregnant and breastfeeding women and patients in general are not included in randomized trials. Look at the data on the slide. They looked at 1,333 randomized trials in medicine in general. And of those over 1,000 randomized trials, pregnant women were eligible for 13 of them, 1%, breastfeeding for 6, 0.5%. Eligibility in pregnancy was not even thought of in over a fourth of them, and breastfeeding eligibility was not addressed, was not even thought of in over half of them. Amazing. And there was, and as you can see, there were also, when pregnancy or breastfeeding were excluded, it wasn't even discussed why. And there were exclusions, which, makes my blood boil. To be able to provide, best care in pregnancy, we need to be able to include pregnant women and breastfeeding women and patients in general, individuals in trials. And I know that you guys will go over some of that data. But that just gives us an idea how the discrimination that goes on in science regarding, unfortunately, pregnant and breastfeeding individual. I'm going to pass it on to Steve. Take it away. We have your slide on, Stephen.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to present this work today on behalf of my co-authors, including Dr. Dieter, who's a resident at Houston Methodist currently. But this study we're discussing is obstetrical randomized controlled trials, individuals screened, approached, and enrolled. The use of randomized controlled trials is predicated on the idea that the study group is representative of the overall clinical population. In pregnancy randomized clinical trials, it has been stated and reported in the past that it is difficult to recruit these patients. It is difficult to meet enrollment targets. And there have been questions of a selection bias potentially in obstetrical RCTs due to the high number of women screened and the relatively low number of women enrolled. This was most recently brought to the fore with the ARRIVE trial, when some of the critiques of that trial had suggested a selection bias secondary to only 27% of eligible women agreeing to participate in that study. This was the impetus for our research letter, which attempted to analyze the number of assessed and to enrolled individuals in contemporary obstetrical randomized controlled trials. In order to do this, we assessed randomized controlled trials from 6 journals, including New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Lancet, AJOG, BJOG, and Obstetrics and Gynecology over a 4-year period from 2017 to 2020. Studies that reported patient recruitment data per the consort guidelines were abstracted, and trials were categorized as preventative or therapeutic based on the primary outcome. Wilcox and rank sum testing was utilized for analysis, and p-values less than 0.05 were considered significant. In this study, we did identify 240 contemporary obstetrical randomized controlled trials, of which 193 or 80% reported data on the number of individuals screened and recruited. This 80% number is consistent with prior data, most recently by Bruno et al., finding that approximately 80% of RCTs and obstetrics are compliant with the consort guidelines. Looking at our results, we examined the differences in the number of patients assessed, eligible, declined, and randomized, both in total and also based on primary outcome. As you can see here, trials that utilized treatment as a primary outcome had significantly higher number of women assessed, found eligible, and subsequently randomized. Looking at the ratios of women assessed to randomized, we found preventative trials had a ratio of 2.4 and treatment trials 2.56. The number of women eligible to being randomized and subsequently randomized, the ratios were 1.13 and 1.09. Following randomization, the number of patients who either withdrew consent or were lost to follow-up was quite small. There was a statistically significant difference in loss to follow-up between the 2 groups, though I would note the median number lost in the prevention studies was only 3. So based on these results, this suggests that we are successfully casting a wide net of individuals when we're assessing for randomized controlled trials, since that ratio is greater than 2. The ratio of women eligible to randomize of 1.13 and 1.09 in the 2 cohorts is consistent with the idea of the majority of eligible patients being enrolled. And this is in keeping with previous research, and one example of which was by Sutton et al. Back in 2017, suggesting that between 80 to 90% of pregnant women are willing to participate in observational studies, and 86% of women were willing to participate in a randomized controlled trial with a lifestyle intervention. So these results show that women are interested and willing to participate in randomized controlled trials, provide evidence that selection biases, while real, are a minimal risk in obstetrical randomized controlled trials, and goes back to your point on the initial slide, Dr. Bergella, suggesting that recruitment itself should not be seen as an obstacle and a reason for excluding pregnant women from randomized trials. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So that's perfect. So far, like you just said, Steve, unfortunately, the problem is medicine, and physicians and researchers were not offering pregnant women to be randomized. But if they are, what you just showed us is that they're willing, and we need to. I think one of the main messages here, we need to thank them, for being for willing. They consent as much as anybody else, and it also doesn't matter if it's a preventative or treatment trial. And that's an industry standard that you're gonna know that no matter who and what you're studying, about 50% or a little bit more, won't be consenting. But pregnant women certainly are as altruistic as anybody else, which is amazing. The next 2 talks, I'll give the next couple of 4 or 5 slides, and then we'll have another study. It assesses so the next step is, if the woman does consent, and they do consent, how do they do? Is it a risk for them to be in a randomized trial, to be a participant in a randomized trial, or is it beneficial or risky? And again, this study that one of our fellow published, I believe this year in AJOG MFM, it's compares outcomes in participants sorry, I have a cold, versus non-participant in randomized trials, and we did a systematic review. So as I say, does participation in a randomized trial of obstetrics accrue benefits or risk? And obviously this is important as we're, for the consent process for trialists and for individuals. So we did a systematic review of meta-analysis, and going over 1,000+ records, we identified 17 trials. And we're actually disappointed when we saw this. We were hoping that a lot more trials in obstetrics would have assessed outcomes in non-participants versus participants. So for you guys, girls and boys, so to speak, on here listening, when you're doing a trial, it's best practice to not only follow outcomes of the people who do agree, again, your 30-50% to agree, but also of the 50-70% who don't agree. We did find 17 trials who did that, and so we kind of compared outcomes. And here there are the 17. This is a busy slide just to show you the data. And there's one, the Sorinot one, which is much bigger than others. And then in retrospect, I'll tell you in a little bit, we probably shouldn't have included. But here is the overall data, summarized much better in this slide. So if you participate in a randomized controlled trial in obstetrics, by this meta-analysis, there's a 12%, which I showed in this slide, the relative risk was 0.88 somewhere, here we go. There's a 12% non-significant reduction in your primary outcome. So these trials were looking at different things. Let's say they were looking at preterm birth or preeclampsia or whatever. That outcome was the same statistically in each group, but the trend was for benefit for those in the trial. If we looked at trials that actually had a primary outcome, because for some of the trials, there were many different outcomes, and we had to pick blindly what we thought they were really studying as a primary outcome. So if we took the ones with primary outcomes stated in the paper, the reduction in the adverse outcome was 24%. And if that large breastfeeding RCT, so postpartum RCT, was excluded, there was a significant reduction. So, very sorry. So this actually seemed to be a benefit overall. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask Akila to show her data because it's similar to what I'm showing. Let me put your slides up.
All right, so I'm presenting on behalf of one of our third-year MFM fellows, Dr. Cozy, a study that's also in AJOG MFM, obviously, and we looked at participation not just in randomized trials, but in any kind of obstetric study at a single center. And what we wanted to look at was overall pregnancy outcomes. So just as we've kind of discussed, there's mixed data on the impact of participation in trials, not just in the medical literature in the general population, but even less in the pregnant population. In fact, some systematic reviews, meta-analysis have mixed obstetrics and gynecologic patients. And then Dr. Bergella just presented the most recent one. But what was important about these is that they really looked at the outcomes in those trials themselves. So not overall pregnancy outcomes, but say the trial looked at preterm birth, you saw potentially an improvement in preterm birth, not just general pregnancy outcomes. So in our study, we sought to evaluate the association between participation in obstetric studies and composite maternal and neonatal outcomes at a single center in Southeast United States in Alabama. And we hypothesized that patients who chose to participate in trials would have improved outcomes compared to those who chose not to participate in trials. So to study this objective, we did a retrospective cohort study of all patients delivering at our institution over a 6-year period. Patients were over 13 weeks, just to exclude early fetal losses and the ability to be in a study, as well as major anomalies. If there were multiple pregnancies in the time period of which there were a number, we only put the first pregnancy in there. So patients were classified or categorized by their exposure, whether they participated in a study or whether they did not participate in a study. And further, the obstetric studies we characterized by type. So whether they were randomized trials, whether they were observational designs, and we also characterized them based on when patients were recruited into the study. So was it an outpatient antepartum study done in a prenatal clinic? Was it an inpatient study? Was it an intrapartum study? So we really collected all of this information to look at types of studies and their effects as well. So in terms of our primary outcome, it was a composite of maternal morbidity and mortality up to 6 weeks postpartum, with a number of known morbidities and significant findings associated with maternal health. We also looked at neonatal morbidity and mortality as a composite with items listed there, and looked at each individual component as well. So analytically, we compared outcomes between those who did participate and not. We calculated adjusted odds ratio, looking at covariates that were differing in terms of the baseline characteristics with the strict alpha of 0.001. And then we really used different assessments of collinearity to avoid over-adjustment between participants and non-participants. We also did some secondary analyses looking at effects by study type, so trial or observational study, the time point of enrollment, and whether a patient was participated in more than one study. So for our results, we had over 24,000 deliveries at our center in the 6-year time period, of which about 20,000 met criteria, about 20% of whom participated in studies. During the study period, there were 77 independent studies conducted at our institution, about half trials and observational studies. The majority of them were enrolling as an outpatient, followed by intrapartum, and then finally inpatient antepartum. Looking at our study participants, the majority of people who were participated in studies participated in trials. Again, the majority were either outpatient or intrapartum, and the majority were in one single study. Our patients that were in the studies were quite different than those not in the studies, which is why we did adjusted analysis for the variety of factors we describe here. So looking at our results, and just to highlight some important ones, the composite maternal outcome was significantly decreased. So there was a 17% significant reduction in composite maternal outcome in patients who decided to participate in any type of obstetric study versus not. And this was significant decreases in transfusion as well as postpartum ICU admission. There was also shorter, but maybe not clinically significant decreases in maternal length of stay. When looking at our neonatal outcome, there were significant improvements in neonatal outcomes across the board, not only in the composite neonatal outcome with approximately a 47% risk reduction in composite neonatal morbidity, but also an 80% risk reduction in miscarriage or fetal death, low APGARs, NICU admission, and NICU death. So really significant, impactful outcomes with neonatal health. Furthermore, when we looked at it by study type and study outcome, we saw a consistent response with the neonatal outcomes based on the type of study and time point. But in terms of the maternal outcomes, really only saw these significant decreases for trials, so randomized trials and intrapartum studies. So kind of to summarize that, participants had 17% lower odds of composite maternal morbidity versus those who didn't participate. They had almost a 50% lower odds of composite neonatal morbidity, as well as multiple components that contributed to that. And these findings of improvement in outcomes were similar for neonates regardless of study or time point, but maternal findings were only most pronounced amongst trials. So in conclusion, we concluded from our findings that elective participation in obstetric studies was associated with decreased maternal and neonatal morbidity and mortality. And this held true in a variety of subgroup analyses. It's important to note that patients who choose to participate in trials may be different at baseline. They may also be getting additional screening. So it's hard to tease that apart in this retrospective study. But I think what our findings support is not just the safety of participating, but the importance and potential other incidental benefits of participating in obstetric studies. And so further studies are needed to better understand why participants have improved outcomes, acknowledging selection bias and the potential benefit from additional surveillance within a trial setting or a study setting. And that's all I have.
We can't hear you, Dr. Bergella.
Sorry, great presentation. I love the work you do in University of Alabama. This is, when I saw this paper in my editorial box, I went crazy. I was so excited about the data. And we'll talk more in the discussion, but I wanted to share this comment from Karen Fox. Great data about impactful outcomes for participants, especially for those patients who have some concern about participation negatively impacting their care experience, which obviously, shouldn't be the case. And, we'll go back to this, but this is really important that, again, pregnant women should be included. They agree to consent, and if they consent, they actually do better. That's kind of the data we have, and they just presented. So Anna is next. I'm going to show you a slide, and you can take it from here.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to present on behalf of our research team our published study entitled "How Many Obstetrical Trials Actually Reach Publication," a cross-sectional analysis of clinicaltrials.gov and PubMed from 2007 to 2019. Now, we all, I think, agree on this panel that evidence-based medicine is very well guided by clinical trial data and is important. More specifically, obstetrical trial data guide our practices in obstetrical care, and understanding the characteristics of these trials is vital to furthering the field and improving care for our patients. So our aims with this study were twofold. First, we wanted to characterize the frequency of publication and trial characteristics of obstetrical trials in the US between 2007 and 2020. And then second, examine time from trial completion to publication during this same timeframe. Data of trials registered on clinicaltrials.gov between October 1st, 2007 to March 9, 2020 were downloaded from the AACT database. And from here, we performed a cross-sectional analysis of obstetrical trials that were completed with an intervention design and at least one site in the US between the stated time frame. And as you can see here, this figure shows a little bit more detail about how these trials were selected. Our primary exposure variables were first funding status, then primary purpose or focus, and then also therapeutic foci of the trials. Funding status was classified as either government, industry, or academic, and then trial characteristics were cross-referenced with PubMed to determine publication status up to 2021 using the National Clinical Trial Identification Number. Some of the exploratory variables that we looked at, just to state a few, were allocation scheme, blinding enrollment, number of arms, number of sites, phases, and presence of data safety monitoring committee. Distribution of these trial characteristics were explored and compared among trials that were published versus not published, and then association between funding status, primary purpose, and therapeutic focus with publication among these completed trials were studied using regression analysis. So of the 1,879 obstetrical trials with registered completion, a total of 575 had at least one site in the US and were completed by 2019. And we saw that between our study More than 2/3 reached publication, with annual rates of publication ranging from 46.4% in 2018 to 70.0% in 2007. Most of the trials were government or academically funded. The primary purpose of most trials was treatment or prevention. And then the three most common therapeutic foci were nutrition, mental health, and cesarean delivery. We found that funding, primary focus, and the top three therapeutic foci were not associated with a significant adjusted risk of publication within our study period. And also that trials with characteristics indicating high trial quality, such as randomized allocation scheme, greater than 50% of patients enrolled, greater than 2 sites, and presence of a data safety committee had actually increased odds of publication compared with those without such characteristics. Additionally, temporal analysis demonstrated variability in time to publication among obstetrical trials, with a median time of 20.1 months after trial completion, and with most trials that reached publication having been published by 40 months, or about 2 years. Some of the strengths of our study include a large sample of obstetrical trials over a 13-year period, and our rigorous data extraction, including both manual extraction by a very large research team and a coding algorithm. Limitations included possible misclassification, data entry, and changes to our database over time. Additionally, we were not able to determine whether publication was ever attempted for some of the trials, and excluded several trials in our time to publication analysis due to discrepancy in timing. To conclude, our study suggests that publication of obstetrical trials still remain suboptimal, with significant differences observed between trials and indicators of high quality compared to those without. And we're hopeful that these findings will motivate researchers to, such as those in this meeting, I think, and to keep pushing the needle forward and overcoming these barriers so that we can improve care for our patients.
Thank you. Great presentation, Anna. The next one by Mega, it's on a similar topic. So important. You showed us that 1/3 of trials don't get published, and that shouldn't be that way. We need to go after those investigators, make sure that those trials get published. But on the same note, Mega, you want to take it away?
Yes. Hi, thank you for inviting me. And on behalf of my co-authors, I would like to present the study Unpublished Completed Obstetrical Randomized Clinical Trials registered at clinicaltrials.gov. How big is this issue? So clinicaltrials.gov, we all know, is a publicly accessible database of RCTs maintained by the National Institutes of Health, the United States Congress, and subsequently multiple non-governmental agencies and peer-reviewed journals mandate that RCTs be registered in this database. On clinicaltrials.gov, OBGYN has amongst the lowest number of RCTs registered by medical specialty. And just as Anna stated, recent studies also suggest that approximately 70% of obstetrical RCTs registered on clinicaltrials.gov are completed, and 40% of completed RCTs remain unpublished. So while there are studies that have examined important factors associated with trial completion and publication, there's limited data on barriers to the publication of completed obstetrical trials. So the primary objective of our study was, one, to compare the characteristics of all completed published versus unpublished obstetrical RCTs registered on clinicaltrials.gov between 2009 and 2018. And the secondary objective was to survey corresponding authors of all completed but unpublished obstetrical RCTs to collect data regarding barriers to publication. This was a cross-sectional study that queried clinicaltrials.gov for all completed obstetrical RCTs registered between January 1st, 2009 and December 31st, 2018. For each RCT, we abstracted data on trial characteristics. And then to identify publication status, similar to Anna's study, we performed PubMed and Google Scholar searches. Finally, we collected email addresses of the corresponding authors from clinicaltrials.gov and departmental websites, and authors were contacted to inquire about their publication status. During the 10-year period, more than 20,000 trials were registered on clinicaltrials.gov that met our criteria, and following exclusions, there were 647 completed obstetric RCTs. After PubMed and Google Scholar searches and following email correspondence with corresponding authors, 58% of completed obstetrical RCTs were published, and 42 remained unpublished. This table presents the characteristics of all completed obstetrical RCTs registered on clinicaltrials.gov by their publication status. So compared to published RCTs, unpublished RCTs are more likely to have a small enrollment size of less than 50 participants. They had shorter time to completion and less likely to be conducted at multiple sites. Finally, authors of completed obstetrical RCTs who responded that their RCTs were unpublished were invited to respond to a survey examining perceptions on barriers to publication. 84% of the respondents reported that they had conducted the data analysis. 73% had completed manuscript. 32% had started a manuscript submission, and 21% achieved a manuscript submission. The main barriers to publication reported by the respondents were lack of time, 30%, change in employment or completion of training, 25%, results not statistically significant, 15%. In summary, among the obstetrical randomized clinical trials registered and marked as completed on clinicaltrials.gov, over 40% remain unpublished. Unpublished trials were more likely to be smaller studies and conducted by researchers who reported experiencing a lack of time as the most common barrier to study publication. Thank you.
Thanks, Mega. And, we may be hitting the tip of the iceberg because these trials were registered. There may be other trials that may be registered and not reported. And, I just feel very strongly, and we'll discuss it, that, if a woman consents, to an RB and submit to a study, it's really, unethical, I would say, using a strong word, for an author not to report those data. I know it's difficult to publish in 10, 20, 30, 40 patients, but there are 83 journals, and those few patients, data may be helpful for a future meta-analysis or a future study.
Right.
And we'll discuss this more. Next is Aaron, and he'll talk, as you can see, about impact factor bias on RCTs. Aaron.
Hello, hello all. Thank you for the opportunity once again. So our group from Hadassah Medical Center, we looked into is there existing impact factor bias in RCTs in obstetrics. So we know the meaning of these two words, impact factor and bias, but what is the term impact factor bias? So we know about publication bias, which is the tendency of investigators or reviewers to accept a manuscript that's got positive results. So impact factor bias is a kind of publication bias, meaning that studies that have got a positive result will be published in a higher impact factor bias, so in a higher impact factor journal. So we know in previous studies in different fields of medicine that impact factor bias have been reported. Specifically, this is a quite recent study in ophthalmology from an Israeli group as well, that found that the studies that they looked into over 800 RCTs in their field, and they find that studies that had a higher had a positive result were 3 times more likely to be published in a higher impact factor journal. So we were examining, does the same happen to us in obstetrics? So we searched for the leading journals in our field. First of all, the 4 weekly journals with the highest impact factor, the New England JAMA, the BMJ, and the Lancet. And the lower impact factor group, not exactly low, but are the monthly published journals of the AJOG, the Green Journal, the White Journal, and the BJOG. So altogether, we found 125 RCTs in the time period between 2018 and 2020. And we see that impact factor did not differ between the groups. Neither between the groups, meaning the ones with the positive result and the negative result. And also, if we classified as the studies being published in the higher impact factor group, also no difference were found. After performing a logistic regression, we found that the only factor that was associated with the publication in the higher impact factor group was the number of authors, which was the only significant factor. We see that positive result did not differ between the groups and was not associated with publication in the higher impact factor group. So thank God we found that no impact factor bias exists in our field. We did find that more authors was associated with publication in the British Journal. Thank you.
And thanks, Aaron. Again, I was pleasantly surprised when I saw your data, and thank you for publishing in HOGMFM. We're going to kind of do one last presentation, last but not least by any move, and by any means, Mega is going to talk about an extremely important topic, racial and ethnic representation in RCTs.
All right, so the inclusion of minority groups in RCTs is one of the requirements of National Institutes of Health Revitalization Act, specific to obstetrics, to potentially mitigate the acknowledged racial and ethnic disparities in obstetrical outcomes. Individuals from all minority groups should be recruited into RCTs, and also in similar proportion as people delivering in the United States. For these reasons, it is important to know the racial and ethnic makeup of individuals participating in RCTs. Because RCTs influence recommendations and practice bulletins published by ACOG, we wanted to examine the demographic data of RCTs referenced in obstetrical practice bulletins, with a focus on whether the racial and ethnic distribution among individuals participating in these RCTs reflected the demographic data of those who delivered in 2019. So sample representative of the population. We conducted a cross-sectional study evaluating obstetrical practice bulletins that were published or reaffirmed from January 2007 to January 2021. Each RCT referenced in practice bulletins was reviewed regarding racial and ethnic makeup of individuals recruited, geographic location, number of sites, whether they received external funding, and we compared the racial and ethnic diversity in the RCTs for 4 groups: non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black, Hispanic, Asian, and others. The chi-score test was used, and p-value less than 0.1 was considered significant. During our study period from 2007 to 2021, there were 37 obstetrical practice bulletins that were available for analysis, and they had over 3,600 references, of which 244 were RCTs. Of these, 41% were conducted solely in the United States, 44% occurred in non-US countries, and 14 were with international collaborations. This table describes the characteristics of RCTs and ACOG practice bulletins by location of trials, so US trials versus non-US trials. So RCTs that were conducted in the United States differed considerably from those not conducted in the US in whether they were externally funded, the type of journal they were published in, and the extent to which they were linked to our recommendations. Among the trials conducted solely in the United States, it is important to note that only 49% described the race and ethnicity of more than 20,000 participants that were involved. And the demographics differed from deliveries in the United States in 2019. You can see here that non-Hispanic Black women were overrepresented in RCTs, whereas non-Hispanic white and most considerably Asian women were underrepresented. So in summary, about 1 in 15 recommendations in obstetrical practice bulletins is based on RCTs. Most RCTs referenced in ACOG practice bulletins have been conducted abroad, not in the US. Moreover, 50% of RCTs conducted in the US did not report on race and ethnicity of their patient population. And of those who reported, the race and ethnicity did not reflect demographic data of those who delivered in 2019. And 2019 is a reference year because that's when we performed this study. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being timely, being comprehensive, and being to the point. We can open up the discussion. I certainly have plenty of notes and questions I've taken, but does anyone want to start? Otherwise, I'll be happy to break the ice. I have a question, for example, for Akila. I loved your study. Your last bullet points was on the why, and what we've been talking about is, if pregnant patients, should be offered to be in randomized trials, and they're not. So point number one, you guys showed if they're offered, they consent, just like anybody else, despite, being, two patients instead of one and all the possible risks to their babies, but they're altruistic, they consent, and they actually do better if they're in a randomized trials. And that's novel because I don't think people showed it before. And now we have two data sets, yours in particular from Alabama, Akila, showing that they do better. Can you expand on the why you think they do better?
I think there's a number of potential reasons. One is the patient themselves. So a patient that chooses to participate in a trial may be inherently different. For instance, with the pregnancy, they may be more likely to attend their prenatal visits. They may be more likely to seek care if there's a problem. There could be difference in social and demographic factors as well that play a role into why they choose to participate in studies. Looking at the characteristics of our population, they were actually reflective of really more of our lower socioeconomic patients who were in the trials. And they may also just be at an inherent disadvantage. If we look at, Alabama and the state of maternal morbidity and neonatal mortality in Alabama, it may just be that these patients are getting adequate care in these settings. The other thing that I think is important is that we looked at randomized and observational studies and saw a benefit. So it may just be the increased surveillance with the study protocol. So patients are coming in and having follow-up visits and having, whatever baseline and procedures done with trials. It's a little bit harder to explain with an observational cohort, but still it could be the procedures done. So they come in perhaps every 4 weeks. They have a 1 hour visit with a research nurse. So all of that may just be, another way to say they get seen more often and they show up more often. And I know there's a lot of studies looking at prenatal care and visits and outcomes, but it may just be that additional surveillance that's given to somebody under the auspices of like a close eye, because they're in a trial, may really be the thing that's impacting outcomes.
And you showed a 50% decrease in neonatal composite, which is huge. I think that the data, both yours and ours, the patients are not that different. The one that consent, that don't consent. I think it is, and I hope it is more. Even if we need to study more, the fact that they're following a guideline, like you said, they're more in touch with the research nurse. They may have a few more visits. They have more people following them, and hopefully, what we're telling them to do, they're doing more, and therefore they have better outcomes. But that was very impressive. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it was surprising for me to even see those effects with the observational studies.
Right.
We know that trials are different because there's an intervention, but just in an observational cohort where patients are being observed, and there's no difference in intervention, I think was really interesting to see from that standpoint. And also looking at the different time points of the trials, that it's kind of in terms of neonatal benefit, it's any study is very important. So even if you are, don't qualify for a randomized trial, there may be an observational trial that you can still help be altruistic, but even get an incidental better outcome than if you were not to participate.
Yeah. No, well said. I have a question for Anna. You actually you have a comment. Anna.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I can also imagine that patients with more surveillance and more points of contact with the healthcare system allows them to be more familiar with the healthcare system. So if something comes up during their pregnancy, they probably feel a little bit more educated and maybe empowered to kind of how to troubleshoot, who to call, where to go, things like that, which I think a lot of times can be barriers too.
And I think to that note also, I would also be interested in knowing what are the reasons for patient non-participation in these trials? How is it trial design? Is it that, you know, women come in with a mindset of what they actually want? They don't want to be randomized to placebo. They want the intervention versus vice versa, right? So I think it's, I think for a study moving forward, I think that'd be an interesting thing to look at, to ask the patients who are declining to participate, what are their reasons?
Yeah, and I think anecdotally, and we have some of this for some of the studies in our study, but I think anecdotally the largest reason for non-participation in any study is that they don't qualify. Is really what it is. It's less of a distrust, at least in where we are geographically, than it is just they don't qualify for studies. And when we looked at that small group, it's not in our paper, I don't think, but when we looked at that small group that didn't participate, and then looked at how many just didn't qualify for any of the studies, it was a good size portion of that.
And you know, as a clinician who offers randomized studies almost on a daily basis, and I know you guys do too at your institution, I think also a lot of people are mistrustful a little bit of research. You know, am I in experiments? Am I a guinea pig? You know, you hear those comments all the time. I don't want to, you know, participate. And I think I almost wish in the future consent forms RB would have your study, Akila, other similar studies. At least on that note, you know, if they don't qualify, fine. But if they qualify, we can reassure them that if they participate, their outcome is going to be the same or better. If they, you know, probably be better, you know, given your data, that if they don't participate, and that's reassuring. I'll tell you, you know, for example, in the past, I did lots of studies on cerclage, and it was amazing. You know, for 5-6 months, nobody wanted to be in because they didn't want a cerclage, and then another study will come out for the next 6 months. They didn't want to be in because they didn't want not getting the cerclage, and they will go to the next hospital to get this. Like, things change all the time, and there's biases, and certainly, if you can tell them, look, you're in the study, and you're going to do better no matter what, that will be helpful, I think, for the patient, for the family as well, for the support, and also making us feel better that what we're doing, no matter what we're doing, seems to be beneficial. I have a question for Anna, if she doesn't mind. So one of the issues was, how do we get to publications, right? So the woman, hopefully, patient consents, you do the thing, and then you need to publish it, which kind of was the second half of our talks. Do you think that 3 years, 3.5 years, you know, when you found, you know, the 40 months, you know, 2 to 3 years time to publication, were you surprised? Was it too much, too long? You know, I want, you know, I was kind of spinning in my head about what that meant.
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, I was expecting longer. I think anytime I've worked with someone who's worked on a clinical trial, I feel like it's been never ending. But part of me wonders if all of the barriers that we discussed in some of the studies that I've probably taken more interest in, or that I feel like have been more important to me, I've just seen to take longer in order to generate, you know, high quality data and have it be a high quality study. And so I was pretty surprised in terms of the barriers and how long it takes to publish a clinical trial. I think I thought a lot about like training of researchers and also resources. I think, you know, we need to support and motivate people who want to do this kind of work, and not only financially, but I think in just like education and training. And I don't know if it becomes something where, you know, our trainees engage in a clinical trial and things fall off. And I know that there's data to show that, you know, people move on to another place and work in another place, and they no longer want to continue that work. And so I think more like supportive measures in order to support people in continuing their work and motivating to do that would probably contribute. or help with that. But overall, I think just valuing this work is super important, even when the findings aren't significant. I think to one of Dr. Gupta's points or someone had made a point about that clinical trials with like positive findings are more likely to be published. And I think there's something of value to take from trials with null findings, actually, and to support that work as well when it comes to promoting it and publishing it, because I think that's just as meaningful for our guidelines and our practice. So those are just some thoughts.
Meg, I'm sure you have a comment on that.
Yeah, well, in my study, we found that unpublished RCTs are smaller enrollment size, shorter completion time, and less likely to be multi-center. So intuitively, these should be published. These completed RCTs should be published at similar rates as more complex RCTs, but they still may be susceptible to methodological limitations like inadequate sample sizes or study designs. There's publication bias, like Anna just mentioned. And then there's lack of time and resources to complete analyses. These challenges are especially difficult for early career researchers, those who are more likely to conduct these small RCTs that are completed in shorter time. So they can be completed, but once they're completed, what are the resources that these early career researchers need for completing analysis, manuscript preparation, submission processes? That is all very complex and complex to navigate through.
And I know, you had Mega 269 patients that 269 RCTs, which were unpublished, and you're trying to uncover them and contacting them. Can you comment on that?
Yeah.
Effort, major efforts, you guys are putting in these issues.
Yeah, most of the time when we were looking on clinicaltrials.gov websites for these RCTs and departmental websites, we could not find the corresponding author. There was the emails that were listed on clinicaltrials.gov was outdated. We had bounced emails. We are looking into contact of contact to try to figure out how we can reach these persons who are corresponding authors. And then also on, clinicaltrials.gov, only 15% of all completed trials posted their study results. 15%. 85% of the time, the data that they compiled from completing these trials was lost. There was no oversight. We all know that NIH and clinicaltrials.gov have limited resources, but there still should be that systematic oversight to monitor progress of these clinical trials and ensure timely completion, timely reporting. It was a bit of a frustrating process, which took us a long time to navigate through.
So, message to the people listening, there are thousands of people that listen to this. When you register your trial on clinical trials, don't forget at the end, don't only write completed, but put your data in, and especially from the beginning, use a Gmail, use some kind of email that will be still going 5 years later. Again, like you say, these are residents, sometimes students, fellows. They move, their email may change. It's not going to say Harvard or Jefferson or Northwestern or Alabama or whatever. And therefore, use a mentor that maybe that stays there, longer. Use an email that will not change. Really, really important, because it's important we are able to follow up. Aaron, you probably have a comment as well.
Yeah, can I ask Mega, did you have information regarding which of these studies got funding, or the unpublished studies got funding? Because I would think that if you start, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, complete your question.
Because I was thinking, that if you're speaking about students or fellows which are dropping out on this RCT from any of the reasons that you spoke about. So if we know about the conflict of interest that could be with a study receiving funding, but on the other hand, it makes the researcher committed to the study and to fulfill it.
Yeah, unfortunately, so in our data set, there weren't any differences in the funding type for unpublished versus published studies, but that is a good point. I think that for early career researchers, at least most of the funding that they receive, it's internal funding for small pilot studies to be done, which can then be used to apply for federal funding, for NIH funding. But at least in our study, we were not able to find a difference in funding type.
I have a quick question for Aaron. Again, we're all positively surprised that positive findings versus negative findings, they get published at the same rate. At the same time, I'm actually may show your slides again. You did. There almost seemed like in this study, there seemed to be a trend. That a positive result 1.76, and I don't know if you want to comment on that. Also because you studied weekly journal, which are like the New England Lancets of the world, which are going to make the CNN and the New York Times news more if the trial is positive. So I'm just playing a little bit the pessimist side. Maybe if you had a bigger sample size, you would have found a difference, or hopefully not. What any comment on that?
Yeah, so the original plan was actually to only study obstetrics journals only, and to check the higher impact factor group to be the AJOG, the green, the white journal, and then the lower impact factor group to be like more, Q2, Q3 journals. But the thing is that we nearly didn't find any RCTs in the lower standard journals. So we had to go, so our reference was obviously the high impact factor journal. It could be very much, as you say, that the media has an input in this issue. But still, as we could see, it didn't reach any statistical significance, which we were very happy to see.
Yeah, no. Reassuring. One last question I think I have for Mega, to just cover everything you discussed. 49% of the trials described race and ethnicity, from your data, which is disconcerting. Also because your data is not that old. These are up to 2019. I'm actually okay with ACOG referencing for their recommendations abroad trials. Hopefully, abroad trials are just as good as US trials. But obviously, the population needs to reflect. And that was kind of your point, the populations you have in Boston or I have in Philadelphia.
Right.
Do you want to expand on that maybe? Or
I think more and more trials now at least are reporting race and ethnicity data because that is something that's required by journals, or they emphasize on that information to be presented. I think unless you have a sample size that's representative of a population, right? That's what we're taught. That's how you should design your RCTs. I think there is this bias that studies, RCTs that are done abroad are not under strict regulations as they are, as the US studies are. And therefore, there's this bias against RCTs that are conducted abroad, whether those results are applicable, whether they're of sound data, and whether they should be repeated in the US population so that then they could be more applicable to our patient population. We are a little bit hesitant to adopt results of trials that are conducted abroad.
But I feel pretty strongly about that. I think a lot of trials done abroad are unbelievably great, multi-center, funded,
Yes.
And I'm not going to mention nations because it's really from everywhere. And there are even, this is not the topic for today, but fabricated, falsified data from the US and falsified, fabricated data from any other country. So I think we'd actually, like you guys did, unbiasedly, we need to look at the quality of the trial and forget the gender of the author, the institution comes from, the nation it comes from, and just look at the data. And I'm reassured that actually, you could look at the glass half empty. That, again, we talked about, the biggest issue to me is that women are not, pregnant women are not asked to participate. So that's really a call to NIH and everybody else. The protocol should include the pregnant women, pregnant individual are included. And if you're not going to include them, why? And somebody should fight that at the review stage. So it should be included. Then lots of individuals who are pregnant participate, which is great. I don't think we can do much better than what you guys presented. Then we can do better maybe in terms of race reporting, like you say, ethnic thing, that kind of stuff. And I think on the editor side, hopefully we're doing a good job. Negative trials are just as important as positive trials. All trials should be reported. Some of the ones that are unpublished, I think, I don't know, Megan, maybe or Anna, you can comment. I think some of them may just be, too small and maybe not as well done. But I bet at least 50% plus should be published because they could be beneficial to the public in general, and it's really refreshing that we have a lot of level 1 evidence in obstetrics and so many trials. So for those of you listening who have a trial who they're doing and they're not published or they're completed, please get them into the literature and try to contribute to better outcomes. And maybe one of the main messages today, which is so important, is that the individuals who are pregnant who consent seem to do better, like Akila showed, which is really amazing positive news. I don't know if anybody else has any comments. I just want to put a quick summary, and we're at the top of the hour. Any last ideas or things you feel strongly about? It was really a good review. We went over lots of data. I want to thank everybody listening for doing some of the trials we've discussed that we could put into our databases and etc. I want to thank everybody who continues to publish in AJOG-MFM, and I particularly want to thank you, Mega, Anna, Aaron, Akila, for a nice, cohesive, collaborative hour here with the AJOG-MFM Live. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.